What am I? What are we anyways? What am I? What are we anyways? Well, hi everybody. Good to see you again. All ye seekers after truth. Fair crowd. I see all my old pals and a few more. Cool. Glad you're here. Father to the man. The child is father to the man. And it's not all roses. Influences that cripple lived life for some of us. Much of what we've explored so far seemed to imply that advanced primate perception, plus fabulously effective 100 million years developed reflexes, added to top-of-the-line motor skills, not to mention language, the wonderful, fantastic word stream, and all these faculties finally augmented by the miracle of cultural amplification of the culture world with all its personifications and developed pleasures and compulsions, which are the sum of who and what we are. And a pretty damn good sum at that. We've done well by ourselves. Pretty damn top of the food chain, lords of God's creation. Where could we possibly go from here good? If somewhat illusory around the edges anyway, according to this book anyways. Although I have mentioned a few times that we have a bit of an obsessive and compulsive self-aggrandizing predilection and a penchant for pleasing stories and species triumphant entertainments, and a hankering for oversimplified and self-serving, somewhat exceptionalistic bromides. An addiction to high-minded and idealistic belief systems, both personal and societal. And of course, tendencies to religious and high philosophical sermonizing about being the pinnacles of creation and of inestimable value, near infinite value really, while intermittently misbehaving a tad once in a while. And of course, there's our wish fulfillment, self-inflating histories. And then there's Hollywood. Don't get me started. It's true that sometimes we prefer to not look beneath the surface, enjoying movie land and the peace and certitude of good books land and elaborate word palaces land. Yet in spite of all our glory, there are signs of plenty that things of every sort go awry. Our fabulously developed genius, rational mind, often enough misspeaks. We at times seem to suffer from various structural illusions and out-and-out delusions. We've made one or two more than egregious errors. The word world hasn't saved us, has even gotten us into serious trouble. Our history, both personal and societal, is often quite a catastrophe and often enough a bit of a travesty. Here's James Joyce again. History is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awake. And our stories about ourselves often enough feel paper thin, optimistic yet clearly missing the mark. Simply put, there are many influences and syndromes that are also at times miscreating and even contorting us along the way, limiting our being and resulting in less than optimally functioning organisms. This is also true for all the wonderful citizens of Animalia, though our abstraction-making brain often enough fails to see the large range of competence and incompetence within each group, large and small. I would suggest that the inability to see the realities of our mind's construction and functioning results in pervasive illusion. We've been known to spout optimistic nonsense about who we are. It does make us feel good. But at times, this is also obfuscating. We seem able to live around our blind spots and even glory and exult in some of our most unsavory characteristics. Our optimistic stories about ourselves hide our truer natures. But at the very least, by way of our smorgasbords of make-believes, it's cognitively incongruent. One biggie belief that is confusing on many levels is the oft-spoken, always implied sense that we are all equal, all pretty competent, all starting out pretty much the same, in charge of the parade and making our own decisions with clear eyes. We're Homo sapiens sapiens, damn it, and that's that, and pretty damn smart and pretty damn in charge. Our minds work well in themselves. Most of us are good old-fashioned standard issue eyes, well-constructed and smooth functioning cells in the best meaning of that term. We believe, hope, that our senses grog the world effectively, that our minds are all pretty much competent and efficient, that what we say is intelligible to each other, more or less, and that, with some exceptions, people all over the world are having a good time, or at least somewhat commensurate experiences. And, under the right conditions, we're effectively talking back and forth. And all of the same cloth, we also take for granted that we are in control of ourselves, that we can choose who we will be today and tomorrow, and who we will ultimately become, both as individuals and as a society. Our media, our bequeathed popular psychology philosophy, our self-flattering Hollywoodization of reality, and our churches, schools, and educational entertainment complexes shape our view of ourselves, puffing us up and shielding us from many of our painful frailties. And our somewhat o'erweening pride blinds us. Our collective hubris has been, by some readings, the source of unimaginable folly and gore. We're pivoting here. We've examined the primordial functioning of our being at the deepest phenomenological and somewhat neurological levels, seen the construction and everyday functioning of the entity and the mind, and tried to relate it to child development, brain structures, environmental patternings, etc. But the brain entity in its environment develops differentially. The fetus develops highly sensitive to its environment. Things can go wrong, small things and big things. And the culture world isn't an abstract theater of intellectual mental exercise. The self, the I, can be hobbled, blind to many things, driven by overwhelming impulses. It's not ideal. The world is not ideal. Have you noticed? Part of the problem is that we wallow in such a highfalutin and divorced from reality sense, which is idealized and romanticized both, of ourselves, and that we confuse and confound even ourselves. The winners want to believe in just and equal starting points, so as not to feel guilty and be punished for hogging the upper echelons. And the losers want to believe much the same, so as not to feel second best, less than. Who wants to feel flawed? Our rather maudlin and sentimental moralities, especially related to children, make us almost unable to see the degree and extent of disabilities inflicted on and afflicting our offspring. Limitations, miswirings, patent absurdities, afflicting ourselves individually and our societies. If the body-brain environment creates and co-creates the self, each component is inextricably and complexly involved in whatever outcome ensues. This is not an ideal process resulting in ideal human beings, but a highly contingent adventure with mixed outcomes. And you may have noticed we're all not functioning optimally. A few slap-in-the-face obvious ones are really powerful and dealt with by experts of all sorts, but forgotten as molding fair numbers of us adults in predictably limiting and long-term painful ways. Less than optimal genetics, mistimings and mistakes of organic development, structural imperfection in any part of the brain-body milieu elaboration. Many of these handicaps have historically played themselves out outside the societal spotlight, outside the limelight of the great philosophers philosophizing, sans news shows and the pathologically trite talk shows, in silent and desperate lifelong struggles away from the media's central stage. These are experiences, biological and or sociological, that create certain children, and more specifically create and limit brain life word functioning. Influences that are pervasive and determining. Some are hard to hear about, but what I want to remind you about is a dimension of living and experience that we do not much talk about. The bland and idealized and lately triumphantly exceptional view we have of the individual blinds us to our limitations as a functioning species. A whispered about one, fetal alcohol syndrome, is a sad and scary brain-bending syndrome that affected and continues to affect a disproportionate segment of our native population here in Canada, but has been afflicting large numbers of children in many cultures for many centuries. Cognizance of the vulnerability of the fetus in the womb is sadly a very recent enlightenment. The results of heavy drinking and the excessive use of drugs, by extension, by women during pregnancy are more or less permanent, like some of the poverty effects in the third world, often transmitted down the generations by behavior engendered by the effect itself. Fetal alcohol kids in heavy drinking societies drink to excess and have fetal alcohol kids. The effects are many and varied and highly unpredictable, except in broad strokes. The intellectual, abstraction processing brain has significant deficits, which is sad enough, but the emotional brain mediates much of the worst repercussions of this syndrome. Destructive and self-destructive impulses, inability to form attachments, cognitive emotional disabilities of many and varied degree. Sometimes effects multiply, like an erratic and extreme dose of hyperactivity and impaired impulse control. Of course, all these influences appear as spectrums of disabilities, continuums from horribly severe to hard to detect. Bear with me, I'm not being perversely negative. I'm trying to point out that the word self and perception self and emotional self are already embedded very deeply in organic conditions that are disruptible and that profoundly influence all these three aspects of personal development. The quality of word self and the deepest reaction patterns of the emotional self are at times so skewed and abnormal that the individual scarcely can partake of even the bargain basement typical activities and richness of the culture. And these abnormalities are often enough result in long-standing thinking, feeling, reaction patterns that are completely determining of the fate of that particular person. Lastly, when verbal emotional automatons are ill-functioning, words do not mean the same thing to different people. Biology rules. By this I mean that if emotional and self-controlling pathways are organically skewed and improperly calibrated, the child person will play out some very painful action-reaction behaviors. The co-creation of the perceptual, cognitive, emotional individual, the self, depends extremely sensitively on initial conditions. One last but often forgotten part of these deficits, these global malfunctioning of areas of brain function, is that language blocks and processing blocks make the individual much more difficult to reach and help, even when help is desired. Fetal alcohol syndrome is often a complex phenomenon because children who are afflicted by it are often also brought up in alcohol-ruined environments over and above the damage to nervous systems and cognitive and emotional pathways. To this lugubrious group, add a number of other drug impairments of the brains of children from parental overuse of stimulants and a wide pharmacopoeia of legal and not so legal narcotics of every kind. Environmental contamination, arsenic, serious industrial pollutants, pesticides, lead, etc., and the like. Only a few hundred years ago, thousands and even hundreds of thousands of men worked in toxic mines and polluted factories in near slavery. And their bodies, and often enough those of their offspring, were poisoned, slowly at times. And we all know that this kind of self-poisoning is not at all uncommon in plenty of places in the world, even today. The air pollution in parts of China, the soil and water pollution in parts of India, excess arsenic in the drinking water that thousands, if not millions of people use daily, lead poisonings, etc., are just some of the more egregious examples of insidious disruptions of present and future functionings of children. Varieties of mental retardation and more subtle brain misdevelopment mimic some of the effects described. Our need to see the world idealistically and our attachment to universal equality of opportunity have us denying or minimizing some of the worst aspects of these hard and often tragic lives. The scourges of heroin addiction, fentanyl addiction, prescription drug addiction, and a variety of other drug addictions. Thousands, hundreds of thousands worldwide die every year, and new cohorts volunteer or seduced into hell every year. Often seemingly invisible to first world denizens, but very significant, are the effects of early malnutrition, severe debilitation of young children by early diseases and diarrheas, and the effects of extremely deprived environments. The numbers run into many hundreds of millions, if not billions. In very poor areas, whole cohorts of children have severely truncated potentialities, borderline mental handicaps, impaired verbal cognitive competences. In poor India and out of the way rural China and many other out of sight, out of mind deprived ghettos, some poor low caste communities were, and still are, almost subspecies in their functionings due to these destructive influences, as has been true of many other places in this world of ours. Height, weight, brain development lagged some 10-15%, and poor maternal nutrition and care, sparse and barren childhood environments further exacerbated delay. Living among people who have been so afflicted is painful, to say the least. And furthermore, you will almost never hear anybody mention the degree of malfunctioning, the obvious source of the debilities, and the truncated present-future life paths of those suffering from these untoward influences. And whole cultures may become significantly incapacitated when large numbers of citizens are variously impaired. As previously mentioned, it may well be that for all Homo sapiens history, the majority of individuals in certain areas were at least half malnourished, diseased, and ill-protected from brain-stunting regimes compared to today's relative Eden. So much so that what might be considered modern cogitation and language social development were severely curtailed, with whole swaths of imperfectly functioning suboptimal humans scarcely making it, never mind flourishing. All this relates to a modern sense of almost ideal development. The existence of all animals is contingent and subject to many nasty outcomes out of the box. Organic and environmental limitations. There are some profoundly debilitating physical diseases of childhood, which are pretty obvious, numbers being small. There is the 1% of relatively severely mentally handicapped individuals. There is the 2% of children who grow up in families where one parent has severe mental illness, often a familial marital parenting tragedy, besides the tragedy of the disturbed individual, his or herself, manifesting the disease in the early 20s or a bit later, and genetic passing along of the limiting disability is also important. Autism, extreme attention difficulties, aphasias, subtle and profound, dyslexias, subtle and profound, brain pathway deficits that in various degrees inhibit a child's ability to achieve the dominant culture's cognitive and extremely important social developmental milestones. Milestones. We explored the overwhelming importance given to success in school, implantation of automatons and knowledges, the ability to be sociable in so many complex ways. Many other children are scarred by less well-labeled and often misdiagnosed neurotransmitter emotional illnesses of their parents, such as hyperanxiety, compulsiveness, and other relatively life-crashing idiosyncrasies. There is another pervasive, destructive beverage influence that many children grow up under, which is the effects of their parents' alcoholism on their emotional development in about 5% of the population. This is another form of interference in child development. The spike in the number of alcoholics in post-breakup Soviet Union sounded horrendous. Parental alcoholism is horrible enough for the participant and spouse, but it impacts children in myriad ways. And full-out alcoholism doesn't include the more subtle devastation the even more prevalent heavy drinker imposes on families, especially young couples not yet stable and not yet out of the late adolescent self-centeredness stages. Marital discord, violence, and years of introjected pain are visited upon the undeserving youngster, undeserving of such treatment, and molds his, her feeling complexes. Probably equal to this devastating series of chaotic, frightening deprivations are those waiting for kids whose parents are caught in the throes of other major addictions or of the society's reaction to drug use and abuse. Heroin, cocaine, meth, and fentanyl addiction all are scourges for young families. The effects on young mothers particularly disruptive and horrible to watch. Another exquisiteness of self-destruction is the effects of solvent sniffing on whole swaths of poverty-raised youngsters. When you meet kids who don't think or feel or act normal because of early and often irreversible brain injury from glue sniffing, you feel both the frailty of the nervous system and the sadness of potential warped and thrown away for whatever reasons, for whatever variety of reasons. And it's hard to talk about, partially because of political correctness and the secrecy denial that makes it invisible. The experiences of children whose parents are participants in lifelong overt or covert criminal lifestyles. Recurrent violence of many kinds, the deep humiliation and profound loss resulting from long-term incarceration of a parent, and the disabilities resultant from being both disenfranchised generally from the dominant culture and often enough less well-educated and often other multi-generational influences. Modern literature and media fetishizes crime and the police, both simplistically, positively, and negatively. It titillates, modern literature and media, with unending stories of horror, serial killers, violence of every kind. Oversimplified and idealistic moralities make it impossible for average minds to understand the differences that appear in the world. With the quite extreme lengthening of the human lifespan of the last couple of centuries, we've also created a significant segment of humanity that is burdened by cognitive decline and incapacities for many years. Rich societies, for the first time in history, can afford places for minimally competent and somewhat impaired citizens of advanced ages. But we have a great deal of difficulty accepting the degree of handicapping involved and taking it into account in the story about ourselves. Not only late-term dementias and Alzheimer-like declines, but many people scarcely cope with the vagaries of everyday reality because their brains are already fairly severely compromised in their 40s and 50s, not to mention 60s and above. Relatively extreme obesity can often result in years of chronic disability, a terrible burden on the individual and his or her family. Various areas in this large and diverse planet have many adverse and destructive to brain development and functioning eco-niches for both children and adults. And we haven't even looked at the damage done from war, endemic and epidemic violence, disruption of civil functioning in so many ways, etc. We scarcely are aware, it might kill us if we were, of a small part of it. Governments and the entertainment industries must hide all these kinds of calamity. The citizenry are humiliated by hearing about it, and many fear even thinking about it. The idealized portrayal of thinking and the assumption of cognitive competence for all is patently inaccurate when dealing with the general populations of this world. Many individuals in our societies end up scarcely capable of more than concrete thinking. Many are inadept at even the simplest numerical manipulations and basically go along with the herd cultural mentalities around them, both H-E-A-R-D and H-E-R-D, the herd cultural mentalities around them. But in truth, this has always been. We've examined the nature of perception, cognition, and the implantation of knowledges, and found it's not as it seems. Our world creates us in its image. We project the globe, the outside world, as existent and as described. We accept what comes into our heads, what comes out of our mouths, at a high level of encoding abstraction, and presume it is congruent with the world. We project the story world, peopled with heroes and villains, stark geniuses and saviors. We live in movie land and celebrity land and story land because they were implanted so early and without question. And they're so much fun. Our story of ourselves makes nice, with fairly extreme inequalities of nature and nurture both. We dream that everything and everyone has a happy ending. Our cultures, like scriptures everywhere, promise happiness if we just try, and we just try and be good. Happiness even after death to boot. Our schools and pastors, priests and politicians, and sports heroes pander to the sweet myths we choose to live by.